They told him to apologize. They wrote 12 pages filled with diplomatic language, carefully crafted phrases, and political euphemisms, all designed to make a man bow. But before President Ibrahim Traoré stepped up to the microphone at the United Nations, he looked at that document and made a decision. No apology would leave his lips that day. Why? Because this wasn't just about a speech. It was about history, about dignity, about a continent tired of being told what to say, how to feel, and when to kneel. For over 400 years, Africa has been silenced in rooms where decisions were made without her. But on that day, the voice of one man carried the weight of millions. And what he said shocked the world. Brothers and sisters, if you've ever believed that speaking truth should not require permission, if you've ever felt that dignity should never come with conditions, then this video is for you. Subscribe now, because what you're about to witness is more than politics. It's a reckoning. It began with a storm brewing in New York, where whispers from Paris, Washington, and Tel Aviv converged into one message. Read the statement, Mr. President. Keep the partnerships. Don't resist. But Traoré wasn't chosen to be a puppet. He wasn't sent to the United Nations to parrot foreign scripts. He came to represent a nation that had waited too long for a voice. He came to speak for children in Gaza, for mothers in Mali, for farmers in Congo, those whose pain had been traded for silence. And when he walked up to that podium carrying no script, no apology, and no fear, he changed everything. But what happened next stunned even his closest advisors. What did he say? And why did the world scramble to respond? 2 months before that historic moment at the United Nations, President Ibrahim Traoré gave a speech that echoed across continents. He spoke not just as a leader of Burkina Faso, but as a witness to decades of silence and complicity. His words were direct. He named names. He condemned the bombings in Gaza, the foreign exploitation in Mali and Congo, the invisible war waged through debt, aid, and diplomacy masked as friendship. That speech sent ripples through the halls of global power. A week later, a letter arrived from the UN Secretary-General's office. It wasn't an invitation. It was a warning. It said his statements had created diplomatic tension and threatened regional cooperation. It urged him to clarify his position. But in diplomacy, clarify often means conform. And what followed made that intention even clearer. Traoré received calls not from friends, but from handlers, officials from Paris, Washington, Tel Aviv. They came with scripts, suggestions, and subtle threats. We can reconsider development aid, they said. Surely you don't want sanctions. Then they sent the final blow, a 12-page apology written for him, 4 pages of tone adjustment, 3 pages of reworded language, and 5 pages reminding him to reaffirm shared values. But Traoré knew those values weren't his, because shared values don't include silence in the face of genocide. They don't ask a man to bow before he speaks. One night at Ibrahim, his personal phone rang. Not the official line, the private one known to only 5 people. A voice on the other end introduced himself as Ambassador Richardson from the U.S. State Department. "We need to talk," he said. 20 minutes later, a black SUV pulled up to the presidential palace. No flags, no plates, just shadows. Richardson entered without waiting for permission. "Mr. President," he said, "we have a problem." He opened a leather briefcase and laid out satellite images of gold mines, financial records of infrastructure deals with China, intelligence reports on Russian military advisors. "We know everything," he said, "and we're calling it economic cooperation, for now." Traoré leaned back in his chair. "And what do you think it really is, Ambassador?" Richardson paused. The beginning of something that could make your country very uncomfortable. The implication was clear. Resist, and we will destabilize. For 6 months, Burkina Faso had been restructuring every major international partnership. Chinese engineers rebuilt communications networks. Iranian pharmaceutical firms constructed new hospitals. Russian experts helped revolutionize agriculture. Not out of hatred for the West, but because dependence is just slavery with better marketing. Still, Richardson pushed, "Your UN speech doesn't need to be hostile. You can express concerns while preserving partnerships." Traoré looked him in the eye. "When your country invaded Iraq, did you apologize to the UN? When France intervened in Mali, did they ask African permission? When Israel bombs Palestinian schools, do they send apology drafts?" The ambassador closed his briefcase. "You're a smart man. I hope you make the smart choice." After they left, Traoré turned to his security chief. "How many Western intelligence operatives are we tracking in Ouagadougou?" 17 confirmed. "Likely double that in total." "And how many of our communications are being monitored?" "All of them. But we've been feeding false intel for 3 months. Traoré smiled. "Good. Leak a story. Say I'm reconsidering the UN speech. Let them think I might actually read their apology." "Understood, Mr. President." And just like that, the trap was set. News outlets from Washington to London began running headlines. Traoré softens stance. Burkina Faso's leader seeks compromise. In reality, he was preparing a speech that would ignite a movement. But first, he needed to speak to his people. 50,000 Burkinabe gathered in Revolution Square. Traoré addressed them without notes, without hesitation. "They think Africa is still the continent that begs to speak," he declared. The crowd roared. "But we will no longer apologize for our dignity." That moment, captured on phones and broadcast worldwide, became a symbol. Mothers wept. Children cheered. Men raised their fists. And Traoré knew this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all of them. The next day, he boarded a flight to New York. No script. No apology. No compromise. But the real surprise came when his motorcade pulled up to the UN headquarters. Protesters were waiting, not against him, but for him. 200 Africans living in New York held signs, "Africa doesn't apologize." "Traoré speaks for us." A young woman ran beside his car shouting, "Make them hear us." He looked at her, and in that moment, he understood what was at stake. But what happened once he stepped into that chamber, what he said when the microphone was finally his, that's where the story takes its turn. The chamber was thick with anticipation. Delegates from over 100 nations sat in tightly arranged rows, their faces a mix of skepticism, indifference, and quiet amusement. The young president from Burkina Faso, bold, unfiltered, unapologetically African, was about to speak. They expected deflection. They expected compromise. What they got was defiance. Traoré adjusted the microphone once, looked across the hall, and said, "Before you ask me to apologize, let me ask you something. How many times have you apologized for what you've done to Africa?" Silence fell like a curtain. No whispers, no rustling papers, just stillness. He continued, his voice unwavering. "Did Belgium ever apologize for what it did in the Congo? Did France apologize for massacres in Algeria? Did Israel apologize for training militias that destabilized our region?" The cameras zoomed in. Several delegates shifted in their seats. The French representative stood up and walked out. Good. Let him walk. Because Traoré hadn't come for applause. He had come to indict. "You accuse me of inciting hatred because I spoke truth. But when bombs fall on Gaza, you call it defense. When African children starve due to your trade policies, you call it economics. When we rise, you panic." His voice deepened, not in anger but in sorrow. Africa does not need permission to defend its dignity. Then, breaking all protocol, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "This morning I received a message," he said, "from a 12-year-old girl in Ouagadougou. He read aloud, "Mr. President, my teacher says you're going to America to speak for us. Please don't let them make you small. We are proud to be African." He looked up from the screen. "That child has more dignity than this entire assembly." A few aides in the back exchanged nervous glances. Security guards near the exits grew alert. This wasn't in anyone's script. But Traoré wasn't finished. "I'll apologize for one thing," he said. "I apologize that it took this long for an African leader to stand here and speak without fear. I apologize that my predecessors felt they had to choose between sovereignty and survival. I apologize that African children believed they needed Western approval to dream. But I will not apologize for rejecting partnerships that impoverish us. I will not apologize for refusing occupation disguised as aid. And I will never apologize for being African." The room remained silent, not out of disrespect, but out of awe. No clapping, no jeers, just the weight of truth hanging in the air like a storm cloud. What happened next, however, no one saw coming. 3 hours after his speech ended, while journalists scrambled to rewrite their headlines and Western officials rushed into closed-door meetings, an emergency session was called. Not by Europe, not by America, but by Africa. 43 African ambassadors gathered at the Ethiopian mission to the UN. For decades, such meetings were about debt relief, food aid, and vague cooperation agreements. But that night, the agenda had changed. The topic was revolution, not one of bullets but of dignity. By midnight, they had drafted what would later be called the New York Declaration, a formal commitment that no African nation would accept conditional aid, apologize for defending its sovereignty, or allow foreign governments to dictate domestic policies. Within 48 hours, 12 African presidents had signed it. But the real shock wasn't in government buildings. It was in the streets. In Nairobi, students held Dignity Day, a campus-wide forum on African self-determination. In Accra, musicians turned Traoré's speech into protest songs. In Cape Town, murals appeared overnight, paintings of Traoré, Mandela, Nkrumah, and Sankara under the words, "The Unbroken Chain." In Lagos, market women stopped selling goods from corporations tied to exploitative trade. Across the continent, a whisper had become a chorus. Across the world, the media scrambled to contain the fire. French outlets called him dangerous. The IMF postponed debt reviews. The EU froze $27 million in aid. But it was too late. Traoré had spoken, and the world had listened. Even in Harlem, a mural appeared overnight. His silhouette against a blood-red map of Africa, captioned with 3 words, "No apology given." Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, a domino effect began. Haiti's prime minister called him directly. "You've given us permission to remember who we are," he said. Within days, Haiti, Jamaica, and Trinidad announced withdrawal from World Bank programs. Suddenly, Traoré was no longer just a president. He was a symbol, a rallying cry, a reckoning. But even as the world reacted, the question remained: how would the United States respond? Would it double down on pressure, or reconsider its role in the shifting tide? The impact of that speech wasn't just diplomatic, it was deeply human. In the days that followed, something extraordinary unfolded across Burkina Faso. Not anger, not riots, but movement. In the heart of Ouagadougou, thousands of citizens gathered, not to protest, but to build. Revolution Square became a site not of resistance, but of renaissance. Engineers, farmers, students, and mothers came together with one goal: rebuild without permission. Schools long abandoned were cleared of debris by volunteers. Irrigation channels, clogged for years, were restored using local tools. Tech labs were launched, not funded by foreign donors but by the Burkina diaspora, many of whom had sent money with handwritten notes that simply said, "For our future." For decades, Africa had been taught that development meant foreign consultants, foreign blueprints, and foreign loans. But in that moment, Burkina Faso remembered its own blueprints. Knowledge passed down, not imported. And what began as a symbolic act of dignity quickly became a functional revolution. The Ministry of Agriculture reported a 62% increase in local farming initiatives within 2 months. Hospitals began piloting self-sufficiency programs using locally sourced medicine and supplies. A new education pilot, called Teach Without Apology, was launched in 6 regions, rewriting history textbooks to reflect African narratives, not colonial perspectives. But the political shifts were even more seismic. Within 6 weeks, the government had announced full audits of all foreign resource extraction contracts. Every deal signed with mining companies, telecom giants, and infrastructure conglomerates was brought under review, and in a stunning move, the National Assembly passed a bill mandating that 70% of profits from natural resources remain within national borders. That number had been 14% just a year prior. It wasn't just about reclaiming wealth, it was about reclaiming pride. People no longer whispered about corruption, they exposed it. Civil servants were investigated. Middlemen tied to foreign interests were dismissed. In one public trial, a former minister stood before a court as citizens watched live broadcasts, demanding accountability for signing away 30 years of gold rights to a European company for pennies on the dollar. A retired teacher, watching from a village in the north, summed up the moment on national TV. For the first time in my life, justice doesn't feel foreign. Across the political spectrum, something rare happened: unity. Even opposition leaders, long critical of Traoré, acknowledged that his speech had broken a dam. One said, "We may disagree on methods, but the message was undeniable. Africa cannot be free until it stops apologizing for its own existence." The wave wasn't limited to Burkina Faso. In Senegal, student protests forced the government to hold emergency debates on French military presence. In Ghana, independent media outlets started investigative series on World Bank influence in national budgeting. In Zimbabwe, Parliament passed a motion to study the Burkina Faso Doctrine, a proposed framework for economic self-determination. Even in more conservative nations, discussions began to shift. Citizens started asking hard questions. Who owns our land? Who sets our policies? And most importantly, why are we still asking for permission to govern ourselves? But this rise in dignity came with a price. Western institutions didn't stay silent. The IMF delayed debt restructuring talks. European media ran stories labeling Traoré authoritarian. One American think tank wrote, "Burkina Faso risks isolation unless it adopts diplomatic pragmatism." But the people weren't listening to think tanks anymore. They were listening to themselves. In one powerful moment captured by a local journalist, a grandmother held her grandson outside a rebuilt school and said, "I may not read the news, but I know when my country stands tall." That pride was spreading like wildfire. In churches, mosques, and marketplaces, the conversation had changed. No longer about survival, now about sovereignty. But behind that wave of unity and inspiration, a darker question loomed. How would the West respond if inspiration turned into replication? Because if Burkina Faso could restructure its economy, revive civic spirit, and reclaim its voice, what would happen if Nigeria followed? Or Kenya? Or Egypt? That wasn't just political theory anymore. It was a possibility. And possibilities, in the eyes of empire, are threats. Which is why the next reaction, this time from Washington, was not just strategic. It was personal. Because behind every message of diplomacy, there were classified memos. Memos that revealed how nervous they truly were. But before we unveil what the United States did next, there's something even more revealing. how the world beyond Africa began to shift, echoing the call that started with one man refusing to apologize. In Washington, the response was swift, though not public. Within hours of Traoré's speech, senior officials at the U.S., State Department, the National Security Council, and intelligence agencies convened a classified meeting. The topic wasn't just Burkina Faso, it was containment. A 12-page internal memo, later leaked and titled African Leadership Assessment, Post-Traoré Implications, revealed the true level of concern. It didn't speak of diplomacy. It spoke of disruption. The Burkina model, the memo read, poses a fundamental threat to U.S. and Western leverage in sub-Saharan Africa. If replicated, traditional pressure mechanisms will become ineffective within 5 years. The document warned of psychological contagion, a term used to describe how the idea of unapologetic sovereignty was spreading faster than sanctions or aid could stop it. For decades, America's strategy in Africa had followed a clear script: aid in exchange for influence, development funding in exchange for access, military partnerships in exchange for political alignment. But Traoré didn't follow the script, and worse, he burned it in front of the world. In response, U.S.-based think tanks began publishing articles warning of populist destabilization across the continent. Media outlets followed suit. CNN aired a segment questioning the legitimacy of Traoré's election. The Washington Post published an op-ed suggesting Burkina Faso risked becoming the next Venezuela of Africa. But while American institutions pushed a narrative of caution, the streets told a different story. Across the African diaspora, the response was electric. In Atlanta, African American leaders held a town hall titled Dignity Without Permission. In London, a Nigerian British MP quoted Traoré in Parliament while debating the UK's role in former colonies. In Toronto, Haitian activists launched a campaign called No More Scripts, demanding an end to IMF structural adjustment programs. But perhaps the most revealing reaction came from within U.S. intelligence circles themselves. A former CIA analyst, speaking anonymously to a European journalist, admitted, "The problem isn't that Traoré lied. The problem is he told the truth, and he did it so well that people finally heard it." Meanwhile, inside the Pentagon, another fear took shape: regional security. For years, U.S. operations in the Sahel had focused on counterterrorism, with drone bases, special forces, and intelligence hubs spread across several nations. Burkina Faso had been a strategic partner, but now its alignment was shifting. Military cooperation with Russia was increasing, unofficial advisors were training security forces, and a new defense treaty with Iran was rumored to be in development. The idea that an American-trained African officer would now be calling Moscow and Tehran strategic allies sent alarms through the Department of Defense. It wasn't just about influence anymore. It was about intelligence, assets, and long-term access. In response, Washington sent quiet warnings to neighboring governments. U.S. ambassadors across the region began holding consultations about maintaining stability and shared democratic values. In plain terms, they were asking African leaders to distance themselves from Traoré. But those conversations didn't go as planned. In Senegal, a senior cabinet minister reportedly replied, "He said what we've all been too afraid to say." In Nigeria, an internal meeting with security officials ended with one general saying, "If we keep bowing, our children will inherit chains." The shift wasn't ideological. It was generational. Young Africans, empowered by mobile phones, viral videos, and a thirst for accountability, were refusing to apologize for wanting more. And that wave was beginning to influence not just policy, but elections. Political candidates across Africa started invoking Traoré's speech in their campaigns. Billboards with his quotes appeared in cities he had never visited. His words were remixed into music, turned into street art, quoted in sermons. But while the movement was growing, so too was the pressure. The European Union formally froze all new trade negotiations with Burkina Faso. The IMF quietly revised credit scores for West African nations exploring resource renegotiations. American lobbyists began funding opposition parties in countries where leaders showed signs of following the Burkinabe model. It was no longer a debate. It was a battle between the old order and something dangerously new. But what terrified Western capitals most wasn't just the rhetoric, it was the results. 6 months after the speech, Burkina Faso reported full food security for the first time in modern history. Without IMF loans, without UN food programs, without begging, just local farmers, local knowledge, and belief. A transformation wasn't supposed to happen. Not that fast. Not without them. And suddenly, the one question that no one in Washington wanted to ask became impossible to avoid. What if this wasn't just a moment? What if this was the beginning of a model? But what happened next didn't come from government officials or international bodies. It came from artists, students, and journalists, those whose power doesn't lie in policy, but in how stories are told. Because while the politicians scrambled, the narrative had already escaped their control. It wasn't military power or political pressure that ultimately shifted the ground beneath the feet of global institutions. It was the story. The way it was told. The way it spread. The way it refused to be owned by anyone but the people living it. Traoré's speech had not only ignited political change, it had unleashed a media revolution. Within hours of his appearance at the UN, clips of his most defiant lines flooded social platforms. Not from official government channels, but from students, activists, and everyday citizens who had recorded the live stream on their phones. One 30-second excerpt. Africa will not apologize for rejecting poverty disguised as aid, was shared over 20 million times in 3 days. But the reaction from traditional Western media was predictably different. CNN cut the speech down to a single minute and headlined it, "African Leader Escalates UN Tensions." The BBC focused on the French delegate walking out. The New York Times published a carefully worded editorial urging responsible rhetoric in international diplomacy. But none of it worked, because the world wasn't watching through the old channels anymore. They were watching through WhatsApp groups, Telegram threads, and TikTok clips with subtitles in Arabic, Swahili, Portuguese, and Haitian Creole. What terrified Western powers was not just what Traoré said, but that they could no longer control how it was received. The media gatekeepers had lost the keys. In Nairobi, Kenyan hip-hop artist sampled Traoré's voice into tracks played in nightclubs and on local radio. In Lagos, digital billboards quoted him above the skyline. "We were never poor. We were just plundered." In Kingston, a reggae artist released a song titled "No Apology," which debuted at #1 on Caribbean charts. In Harlem, poets held spoken-word nights themed around African sovereignty. In Paris, African diaspora collectives projected the full speech onto a building near the Eiffel Tower. The reaction wasn't passive, it was narrative warfare. For decades, African leaders had been depicted in Western press as unstable, corrupt, or naive. But Traoré had flipped the frame. He wasn't irrational. He was articulate. He wasn't emotional. He was measured. He didn't represent chaos. He represented clarity. And that terrified institutions built on the idea that Africa could speak only when spoken to. Traoré wasn't just speaking. He was redefining the voice. A journalist from Ghana, writing for a Pan-African publication, said it best. For the first time in decades, Africa isn't being reported on. It's reporting itself. But it didn't stop with Traoré. Other leaders began to follow suit, not just in speeches, but in storytelling. Senegal's president released a documentary about colonial reparations. Zimbabwe's state television aired a 5-part series called The Price of Permission, detailing the history of foreign exploitation. In Rwanda, classrooms began assigning Traoré's UN speech alongside Mandela's writings. The global narrative was shifting, not because governments permitted it, but because people demanded it. Yet, the backlash came swiftly. Facebook restricted reach on several African-based news pages sharing Traoré's clips. YouTube flagged full-length versions of the speech for sensitive political content. Western media analysts appeared on talk shows suggesting foreign influence operations were at play, but the numbers didn't lie. A survey conducted 2 months after the speech showed that 74% of African youth between the ages of 18 and 35 had seen or heard part of Traoré's speech. 51% said it changed the way they viewed foreign governments, and 38% reported taking some form of action, commenting, sharing, organizing, or protesting. It wasn't propaganda. It was participation, and it couldn't be turned off. Because the power of media isn't just in what's shown, it's in who decides what matters. Traoré had taken control of that power, and through him, millions had realized that the most dangerous thing a colonizer can't stop is a free story. But the question now is this: can that narrative survive when pressure mounts, when funding dries up, when algorithms get tweaked, or when stories like this become targets of digital suppression? Because while the revolution may not be televised, it will most certainly be tracked. And if the West couldn't control the words, they would try to control the wires. The next chapter in this story won't be fought in parliaments or palaces, but in code, servers, platforms, and policies. The future of Africa's voice may depend on who owns the mic and who controls the mute button. As the world watched the aftershocks of that speech ripple through Africa and beyond, one truth became clear. This was never just about Burkina Faso. It was about what happens when a voice refuses to be edited, when dignity speaks louder than diplomacy, and when the script no longer belongs to those who wrote the rules. But as the flames of confidence spread, so did the winds of backlash. Sanctions tightened. Aid was withheld, foreign investment paused, and across the corridors of international power, discussions grew darker, not about cooperation but about containment. The question no one dared say aloud was now the most pressing one behind closed doors. What if the entire continent stood up? What if the Traoré effect could not be isolated? Because movements born from truth are difficult to control. And when that truth is televised, viral, and deeply personal, suppression becomes almost impossible. Yet the risk was real. If African nations aligned too quickly without economic safeguards, external retaliation could destabilize fragile economies. If leaders leaned too hard into defiance without structure, the West could frame the resistance as chaos. And if the momentum faded, the cynics would say it was never real to begin with. That's why the road ahead is not only revolutionary, it is fragile. Because when history pivots, it often does so on thin ice. The future of Africa's independence won't be secured by one speech or even one leader. It will depend on how long the people remember why they stood in the first place. Will they build systems that outlast speeches? Will they educate the next generation to protect their own narrative? Will they create economies not just of survival, but of sovereignty? And most importantly, will the world let them? Or will it find new ways to punish dignity? Let's not forget, empires don't fall quietly. They respond. They smear. They isolate. They retaliate. But they always underestimate one thing: faith. Faith that truth, once spoken, cannot be unsaid. Faith that justice, once awakened, cannot be rocked back to sleep. And faith that even the smallest voice, when amplified by history, can move mountains. So, let me ask you, was Traoré a reckless idealist, or was he the voice we've been waiting for? Is this the beginning of an African century, or just another moment that fades into silence? And here's the most important question of all. When the next leader stands at that same podium and refuses to bow, will we be listening, or will we be looking the other way? Because if you believe in sovereignty, if you believe in dignity, if you believe that Africa deserves to stand, not beg, then your voice matters too. If this story touched something deep within you, share it. If it stirred something righteous in your soul, speak it. And if it reminded you of the power of standing tall, then do not sit quietly. This is not a time for silence. This is a time for courage. And if you've ever prayed for a world where justice walks hand in hand with truth, then pray with us now. If this story stirred your heart, leave a comment. If you believe that no one should apologize for speaking truth, like this video. And if you want to join us in telling the stories that they can't silence, subscribe to this channel. We'll be here, telling the truth, one voice at a time. And until then, may God bless Africa, the land of unbroken spirits, of fearless dreams, and of a people who will never kneel again.